see you all that are able to get on today, and we also welcome our viewers that may view us later as well. Today is Wednesday, October 20th. It is now 1:30, and we will begin our ninth meeting of Working Group 2. But as I am certainly cognizant of, too many of you have put in way more times than just the meeting that we have had, and so I'm extremely appreciative for your time and attention to this important work that we are doing. We're in day 226 of our activation of our under a state of emergency in North Carolina, and so we continue to wish everybody well, continue to be safe, and be mindful as you go about your endeavors. And again, I thank you for this important work. We do have a guest with us today and look forward to hearing from him today. And so with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Jeff to first introduce our guest, and then Jeff Welty and Greg, I believe, are going to go over our agenda item number 2 with our update on our voting. Jeff?
Yep, thank you, Secretary Hooks. And I will have fuller bios for each of our guests when we reach their moment in the agenda, but we are joined today by Professor Joe Kennedy of UNC Law School and Mr. Deontay Thomas, who is the public defender for Wake County. And would like to personally thank each of you guys for being here, and we'll get to your part in just a few minutes once we do a little bit of housekeeping that we need to do as a working group. And Secretary Hooks, with that, may I move to the item number 2 on the agenda, recapping the voting that we've done?
I do see that Associate Justice Earls has been able to join us. I would also, as always, welcome any comments that she may have as we get started.
No, just again to thank all of our task force members and all our presenters. I continue to be really encouraged by the great work that you're doing on these really difficult issues. So thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your leadership, as well as the Attorney General for this work on this task force. So back to you, Jeff.
Okay, I'm going to attempt to share my screen and show the slides that I sent out earlier, just so that everybody's got them in front of them. We'll see if I can make it happen. All right, it looks to me like I have shared my screen. Does it look that way to you all?
Yes.
Okay, great. And then I'll just play this from the start. So folks will remember that after our last meeting, we were ready for a final vote on recommendations in the area of community policing and the area of reinventing public safety as it relates to violence prevention or violence intervention type efforts. And I'll just go through quickly what I think folks may have already had a chance to look at and see if there's anything else that needs to be done on these. Each of the recommendations that we sent out after the meeting last time passed, most of them were unanimous or nearly so. So the first community policing recommendation was about adopting it as an agency-wide philosophy. That passed unanimously, and there were few, if any, comments on that one. Likewise, community policing recommendation 2 about developing community policing plans in collaboration with the community passed unanimously. Recommendation 3 that the Justice Academy should develop training for agency heads that focuses on community policing and make that widely available throughout the state, also passed unanimously. Recommendation 4 regarding agencies encouraging or requiring officers to spend non-enforcement time in the neighborhoods that they serve also passed unanimously. I will note there were a couple of comments that focused on the term require in the phrase encourage or require, and suggested that requiring might generate resentment or be viewed as kind of an administrative box to check. It might be that encourage and incentivize would be something worth considering if there's a desire to revisit this. Obviously, it passed again unanimously as it's written, so maybe there isn't a need. I'll let obviously the working group drive that decision. Recommendation 5 was about agencies and local governments working together to provide financial incentives for officers to live in the communities they serve. That passed 5-1. The one no vote made a comment that agencies typically don't have funds for those incentives, so the recommendation should really be directed at cities and counties. Folks may remember that this recommendation originally read law enforcement agencies should provide, and we added the reference to cities and counties in recognition of the fact that they may often hold the purse strings. From looking at a few incentives like this across the country, it seems like some of them do sort of filter through the agency. So that's why we included this collaborative, working together type of language. But that's just the context for that vote. The sixth recommendation was to publicly acknowledge mistakes as a way of building trust and transparency, passed unanimously. And the seventh and final community policing recommendation, which may merit some discussion before we move on to the reinventing public safety recommendations, was the one about state and local government providing financial and other supports to grassroots organizations that use proven peaceful strategies to help communities provide public safety for themselves. And then there's a sentence about working together with law enforcement. We had 6 respondents to the survey, so we had 6 votes on all the other recommendations. This one passed 3-2 with one person who had voted on other items abstaining or not voting on this item. Given that there were 2 people that didn't complete the survey and then one person who didn't vote, this seemed like a little bit of a closer call to us. And so I've summarized the comments at a little bit more length. Some of the comments focused on this question of what it is to have a proven, peaceful strategy, with questions about whether that's a good thing in that it requires strategies to be evidence-based, or a bad thing in that it might diminish the implementation of new strategies or experimental strategies. And then there was one comment that even though we had softened the language about communities providing public safety for themselves to kind of step away from any association or affiliation with the watches or patrols that we talked about at several previous meetings, one comment still felt like there was a suggestion of replacing law enforcement or too much of a proactive role for members of the community. So I'll pause there, and Secretary Hooks, I don't know if you'd like to have more conversation now, or certainly I could also go through the 2 recommendations on reinventing public safety if you want me to do that before opening it up to the group. Either way.
Yes, sir. If you could go ahead and take care of the other 2 recommendations and with the idea, and then we'll come back and put this on the screen and with the allotted time address this, because I do believe this merits the discussion from the group.
No problem. And yeah, the 2 on reinventing public safety were not particularly controversial. The first one was about grant funding and technical assistance to support communities developing violence prevention programs. And you can see there's a little bit more granularity about how those might work and so forth. This did pass 5-1. The one no vote came from a member who suggested adding the term job placement as well as job training to indicate that that might also be an important component of programs like this. So something the group could perhaps take up is whether to add that phrase in there as well. And then the last recommendation on reinventing public safety was about the community safety and wellness task forces, similar to the one that Durham has recently implemented that we spent some time learning about together last time. And that recommendation passed unanimously. And per your direction, I'll put back up the community policing number 7.
Thank you, sir. And I would ask the work group, because we don't have all 8 here, but at least give some thought to the previous recommendation. If the job placement resonates with you as well, then we'll try to get the fuller group to come back in, when everybody's available to see if we can add that in, if there's a consensus to add that, if that even provides a stronger consensus for the group or doesn't offend any sensibilities on the job placement piece. With respect to what you have before you, the community policing recommendations, I'd like to open it up to individuals that, and let's kind of start with individuals that may have had concern. If you would like, if you're one of the ones that are with us today, to express some of those concerns that are reflected in the comments. We have about 5 minutes or so to address this unless we need to extend a little bit further. I just want to kind of get it out on the table and learn from each other and maybe widen our perspectives on it.
Yes, this is Kerwin Pittman. Good evening, everybody. I commented on two of these recommendations. So the first one, the one is right before me on proven. The only thing about proven strategies in this particular recommendation, it kind of left a little room to be discriminatory about the funding which programs, and particularly which programs that they might say, well, it hasn't been proven to work, so we're not going to fund this. We're going to fund something that has already been tried and true, and it kind of limits, in my opinion, new ideas from taking place, and might tailor new ideas to particular communities that might need different tailoring of ideas to that might fit just specifically that community. And so I didn't want to stifle them by putting proven it, and so we couldn't issue new innovative ideas. In the other recommendation, the one about the job placement. It's great to, so I wanted to add job placement to that strategy of list of things that organizations should be doing that will be funded, because it's great to train somebody to get a job, but can we actually help them get the job? And so if we could add both of those components together, not only will we assist you with job training, but we will also assist you with actually getting and securing this job we're training you for. And it just strengthens that recommendation, in my opinion, to help people.
So this is Tally. I agree with Kerwin. I think it's great to have training and placement. Certainly in the disability community, people are tired of getting trained and not getting jobs. So I think that makes a lot of sense just from sort of the perspective of folks I advocate for. With respect to this whole recommendation, I think I voted in favor of it, but I remember really struggling with it and having a hard time deciding which way to go. Part of it for me is just not really understanding fully what all of these terms mean and how they could be interpreted. For instance, grassroots organizations. I mean, I would imagine we're talking about, organizations that would be sort of positive forces. But I mean, I could see, certainly what happened in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and, a lot of us would argue that that wasn't peaceful, but that there were sort of militias coming in, and, I'm certain they would argue they were peaceful. And I just sort of wonder about this whole phraseology and what it means versus how it could be interpreted. I think most people would not interpret it in the way I just did, but I'm a lawyer, so I try to see things from different perspectives, and it's just something that I just feel like this recommendation needs some work. And I don't fault anyone because I just think this is sort of hard, but I just think that it's, I don't think we're there yet in terms of even knowing ourselves what we're recommending, or at least that's true for me.
Thank you, sir. Both points well received, Mr. Pittman and Mr. Wells. Anyone else like to weigh in?
Yeah, this is Angelica, and I just want to agree with Mr. Pittman and Mr. Wells in respect to the job placement piece of it. I think that that it is important for us to add that additional staff training can only get you so far if you can't be placed in a job. In terms of the proven piece, I had also asked, like, what are we defining as proven? It is often expensive, but it's also having something be evidence-based is often difficult for some programs because it requires a lot of investment that maybe some grassroots organizations that are doing really promising practices and yet can't afford or have the resources to have their work be evidence-based. So I'm wondering if there's some possibility of doing some language tweaking around that, if we want to do like promising practices or proven and promising practices, somewhere where we can allow for innovation and also allow for things that we are seeing that are working, but yet haven't gotten the official label of being evidence-based. I think that would be helpful, and I think it would open it up to a lot of opportunities for the grassroots agencies that are doing great work. The other piece in terms of one of the comments is provide public safety for themselves, suggest replacing appropriate law enforcement. I go back to this whole piece of, is there a way that we can tweak it again so we can, really put forth this idea that public safety does not equate law enforcement or necessarily crime, but public safety is, again, how do we invest in the social not the social determinants of public safety? And so I'm wondering if we can tweak it again as well to reaffirm what this group has said before, that we understand that public safety does not equate law enforcement. And so I'm wondering if there's a possibility that we can tweak language around this. And I agree with Mr. Wells in the sense that I think that the goal of this recommendation is worthy. We just need to tweak some of the language to be clear.
Thank you, ma'am. We have reached the time limit that we have defined for just this area. But if anybody has something burning on their mind that they'd like to add in, we've had some great comments thus far. Don't let me limit you right now, but I'd like to open it up.
Secretary Hooks, Sheriff Clemens. The Sheriff Clemens, good afternoon, everyone. I just, when I look at that and read that, and we're talking about grassroots organizations, making recommendations is fine, but for some of us, make sure that we're putting in there who we are, identifying what type of grassroots organizations, what type of programs are you looking at, to give us an opportunity to see on one hand what it is that's being recommended and how we can work. I think that when we're talking about these grassroots organizations and peaceful manners, I think the word that comes to my mind is partnership. And if it's going to be about making the community safe, then we're going to need communities and law enforcement working together. And we should not leave that out of any of our conversation, because if the ultimate goal is to make sure we're having safe neighborhoods, then it's going to take all of us working together to make that happen, and not just directing one focus on law enforcement, and leaving out the fact that we have people in our communities that deserve that peace, deserve that safety, and are willing to work with us and be partners in what we're doing, because it's going to take all of us to keep all of us safe.
Thank you, sir. I think that we have had some excellent comments, and so I will ask our substantive leads to kind of work on that language. And if you think that it's preferable, at least, to do a straw poll with two type versions of that may be fine. I think that we have seen a lot of wisdom in the comments that have come through today as well. And I can reflect, it does require that partnerships. And one of the things that I think that, there's been some movement is in the area of trying to create a better public safety environment for our populations that have autism. That does require law enforcement, firefighters, ambulance personnel, all of those that may have sirens and bright lights, and all of those partnering with communities as well. And so that there's a great opportunity for us to expand our thinking as we reimagine public safety as well. And those partnerships are going to be key and critical no matter what venue you come at this at. Jeff, do you think you have enough to come back based on the comments, or do we need to go further?
I think I might need to follow up with some of the members who've made suggestions here. There are a lot of different suggestions. I'm not sure they all point in exactly the same way. So I will reach out to some of the members and see if I can get some assistance in shaping some language, and then present. If we can come to agreement, great. Or if we have a couple different competing versions, we can bring those back. But I'm happy to follow up outside of this meeting with folks who've expressed their views.
One quick thought I have is, I don't know if Deborah or Kerwin or Billy or Chief Letney have specific organizations that sort of fit this, that they might want to sort of say, this is sort of what would it might look like, because that would help me sort of understand a little better what we're talking about here, of sort of, what a grassroots organization that really sort of contributes to the public good and safety, that would just be helpful. So I don't know if, Jeff, if that's helpful, but that's just sort of an idea I have.
Yeah, and I definitely have organizations in mind in particular, and I'll email those to you as well for the sake of time. But I want to just specify that grassroots organizations are very important because they are right there, meaning with the people and of the people, and really hands-on, versus some of these larger nonprofit organizations who are more for financial or fiduciary settings for smaller organizations. And a lot of the times it's the fiduciary, the bigger organizations, nonprofits that receive funding, and the little grassroots organizations that's really doing the work and making a greater impact don't receive it. And so I wanted to really uplift grassroots organizations in this one.
I'll just throw my 2 cents in on it. I think we got to be very careful when we start naming organizations and groups, because if we name someone, we're going to leave someone out. And then we're going to have to set some standards on why we would name one group and not another group. I'm not offended by the term grassroots at all. And so I guess my point on it is, if we're going to start putting a list down, then who is the overseer of that list? Then it becomes very, politically driven, and there's a lot that goes into that. So I think what we need to keep in mind is the spirit of the recommendation. And if a community has something that works for that particular community, then we ought to be able to help them achieve that goal, which is the overall protection of everyone.
Yeah. And just to be clear, I don't necessarily want to support any particular group. I just need some context of what we're talking about.
Thank you. Before we transition over, I did, because everybody did get a chance to weigh in, but I would like to offer that to Ms. Maxwell too, as well, if she has any insight that she'd like to offer.
Secretary Hooks, Associate Justice Earl. So I agree with what everyone said. You just have to be careful when stating organizations, because there are a lot of wonderful ones throughout this state that at a local level help people with job placement and things. And then there's some at a larger level where most of the money goes to the CEOs and the executives. So we by saying grassroots, that saves us that trouble. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, ma'am. And before we transition to our next agenda item, I'm going to again recognize Mr. Thomas and Mr. Kennedy. You're here listening to us. If you have ideas that are even all separate and apart from what we actually brought you here, because you've heard this discussion, we welcome your way in back with Jeff and Greg and Jasmine and Ellen and the whole staff to for some of those concepts, because we're going to tap your brain and your experiences, not only what you talk about, but what we can lean on you for too, as we try to establish a whole of community approach to our work. And so, Jeff, I'm going to turn it back over to you if you need anything to clean up this segment, or we can transition to the next.
Let's keep it moving. And like I said, I will definitely circle up with and rely on some of the group members to attempt to tackle recommendation number 7 again. So be on the lookout, everyone, for you might want to block my number coming up. But with regard to the big issue for today is this is the first of our 2 meetings, working group meetings, that are going to address the general topic area of investigations or criminal investigations. And what we've done, and just for planning purposes so that everybody knows, is that today's meeting will focus mostly on drug investigations. And then our next meeting on November 5th will focus mostly on traffic investigations, traffic stops, searches incident to traffic stops. And we picked those 2 specific aspects in consultation with members of the group because those seem to be the areas that are the most intensely controversial from a racial equity standpoint, and where we have a fair amount of data and information to really dig into. And today, as I think everyone knows, we have 2 presenters, each of whom is going to talk for about 10 minutes, and then I think stick around and be part of the conversation. And so first I'd like to recognize Joe Kennedy, who is the Martha Brandis Professor of Law at the University of North Carolina, where he has taught since 1997. He previously worked at a large law firm and as an assistant public defender in San Francisco, California. He's written for a number of top legal journals and has appeared on CBS, NBC, Fox, and NPR, among other media outlets. I don't know why ABC hasn't reached out to him yet, but I feel certain that they will do so soon. And most pertinent to today's conversation, just in the last couple of years, Professor Kennedy's published a very well-regarded law review article entitled Sharks and Minnows that explores statistical information available about drug arrests across the country. I'm sure he'll talk more about that in his remarks, but thank you, Professor Kennedy, for being with us.
Thank you. All right, that's my cue. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, can you all see my PowerPoint? Yeah, good. All right, let me just. All right, so as Jeff mentioned, I was a public defender for a number of years in San Francisco. And I remember when I started working, I asked myself, where are all the drug dealers? I mean, I was spending days in felony prelim court, and all the offenders I saw, the drug offenders, were being arrested for like really small amounts of drugs. I mean, $20 on average. So when I became an academic, I decided, well, I want to find out what's the literature. What are the quantities for which we're arresting people for drug offenses? What I found out is there was no literature, that the data didn't seem to exist, or if it did, no one was writing about it. So I teamed up with a talented political scientist at UNC, Isaac Una, and we found the data, such as the only data that really exists is through this database called NIBRS. Not all states participated in it. North Carolina was not participating in it, but we found a chunk of data. And we looked at about 1 million cases, and we found usable data in about 600,000 cases. We published the very first study ever done that systematically looks at quantities in drug arrests. We also, of course, looked at other variables, including race. So let me just cut right to the chase. The primary takeaway in terms of quantity is we found out that about 40% of drug arrests were for trace amounts. And by trace amounts, that's 0.25 grams or less. Now, obviously, 0.25 grams of cocaine or of heroin is different from 0.25 grams of marijuana, but across the board, we're looking at trace amounts in 40% of the arrests. If you go all the way up to a gram, that accounts for two-thirds of all the drug arrests we looked at. Now, let's take a minute and look at race. This statistic shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, right? We have, African Americans disproportionately represented in terms of their share of the population, the number of people arrested for drug offenses. But take a look at this finding as well. This looks at the type of drugs for which we're arresting people, right? And you can look at this slide and think, well, the war on drugs is largely a war on marijuana, right? 71% of arrests are for marijuana. But of course, we all know that in terms of our resources, we focus our resources on the hard drugs, especially our resources for incarceration. We focus our punishment more on the harder drugs. And you look there, and what you see is leading the pack is crack cocaine, methamphetamines second, cocaine excluding crack, another 6%, and heroin and so forth. So this is a rough picture of the types of drugs for which we're arresting people in the war on drugs. Now, let's break it down by race. And what we'll see is there are differences when you look between races in terms of the types of drugs for which people are arrested. And again, marijuana is always the big picture item for everyone, for all the races. But you'll see that, methamphetamine and heroin are larger shares of the arrests than you have if you look at the same sort of chart for African Americans, right? For African Americans, what we see is, putting aside marijuana once again, 24% of the arrests were for crack cocaine. And of course, there's large differences in terms of legal consequences between arrests for the hard drugs versus arrests for marijuana. But let's return to this trace amount figure for a second, right? This idea that 40% of these arrests are for literally trace amounts, 0.25 grams or less. And I want to emphasize, we were careful in parsing through this data. For example, this does not include what some people call contacts, right? Sometimes someone will come into contact with law enforcement and they won't end up resulting in a formal arrest. We excluded contacts from the data. These are all arrests, right? And now again, what you'll see is, of course, so let me explain my chart here just a little bit. What we've broken down here is not just the type of drug, right? Those are the columns at the top. But if you look at the legend at the bottom, you can tell the race of the person who's being arrested, right? And on the bottom chunk is white, the darkest blue. The next chunk above that, African Americans, and the next chunk above that, Hispanics. Now, and let's take marijuana out of the picture now, because marijuana, we don't treat, we don't prosecute, we don't punish marijuana the same way we punish the other drugs. So if you really want to get a picture in terms of impact, for these small quantity arrests, this chart sort of captures it for us. And these aren't percentages, this is volume, right? And what should jump out at everybody, I think, is, and again, remember, all of these arrests are trace amount arrests, but those trace arrests are 40% of the arrests that we're making in the war on drugs. What should jump out at everyone is, you can see the huge number of arrests for a trace amount of crack cocaine of African Americans, right? If I was to offer a third big takeaway from our study, would be that the source for racial disparities seems to be driven in part by the type of drug for which we are arresting people, right? And this chart sort of shows some evidence for that finding. Let me give you, now there's all sorts of, of course, I promised Jeff I would not go on for more than 10 minutes, and I will keep that promise. There's all sorts of arguments and questions you can sort of raise in this issue. One of them is, well, wait a minute, we're making these trace arrests because there's other sort of important harms in the community that we're trying to get at. And so that offender who's got a trace amount of a drug, or maybe even a gram of the drug, who we're giving felony liability to by virtue of this arrest, we're trying to get at some of those other harms in the community. Maybe this person is part of a larger drug organization. Maybe this person is sort of a violent offender. Well, I'd love to talk about some of those arguments in the question and answer. Let me give you a peek at a preliminary finding we have from our next article, which is, we said, okay, how many times are these offenders armed? So we looked at how often are drug arrestees armed. We found not often. 81% had no sort of weapon whatsoever at the time of arrest. And if you focus on firearms, it's 7%. All right, so if I was to give you one takeaway from this, one sort of recommendation or suggestion from our work, would be this: data transparency. Law enforcement agencies should track and publish drug quantity, type, and race with respect to their drug arrests. I mean, let me leave you with this sort of thought experiment. Imagine you're the president of some company, and you go to your head of sales and you ask your head of sales, how do you sort of track the performance, the effectiveness of your sales force? And they tell you, oh, we do it on number of sales. And you say, well, you mean the volume of sales? And they say, no, not the volume, the number. So, I mean, if somebody sells one widget and someone sells 10 widgets, those just count as 2 sales? You say, well, that sounds sort of crazy to me. I want to know about how your sales force is doing in terms of volume of sales. Well, if your head of sales told you, we don't keep track of that, I think you'd probably want to get a new head of sales, But that effectively is what we're doing in this area. I mean, we sure on any individual police report buried somewhere, you could find the quantity of an arrest, but law enforcement agencies are not systematically tracking and publishing drug quantities when they make arrests, and they should. And that I'll stop there, and I'd be happy to take any of your questions.
Do we have any questions for Mr. Kennedy or Jeff? Do we want to wait and have Mr. Thomas as a practitioner from what he's actually seeing to day to day give us some insight and then come back? I didn't know how you wanted to design it today.
I think either would be fine, but I believe that both Professor Kennedy and Mr. Thomas are able to stick around for a little while. So maybe we could just go ahead and hear from Mr. Thomas and then just have a full group discussion if that suits you, Secretary Hooks.
I think that would work, because I think there may be some more questions. I want to make sure that we get Mr. Thomas in too as well. And thank you both. This is great to have you.
So I'll introduce Mr. Thomas now, but before I do that, I just wanted to mention that after talking with Professor Kennedy, I went and learned a little bit about data reporting in North Carolina. And if folks want to know more about North Carolina's move in the direction of collecting more information through the NIBRS system, but also some of the limitations of that, I know something about that now, and also could bring to the group, if the group wants, people who know much more about that system than I do. There's been some movement in that direction of gathering more data, but I don't believe that it would be widely published in the way that Professor Kennedy is suggesting. But Deontay Thomas is with us today as well. Mr. Thomas has come up through the ranks in North Carolina. He went to Fayetteville State University, got his law degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, went into criminal defense practice, both in private practice and with nonprofit organizations. He joined the Wake County Public Defender's Office and was promoted within there to become the felony chief at the Defender's Office. And then just last month, Mr. Thomas got his most recent promotion and is now the chief public defender named by the senior resident Superior Court judge in Wake County. So Mr. Thomas, congratulations. And with that, I will let you take it away. But you're on mute, so we can't hear you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Sometimes I always don't feel like congratulations are needed, more like commiserations or sorry to hear that. Sometimes I feel, but I appreciate you guys having me. I'm familiar with a lot of the people on this call, and I think you all have done, just looking at the slides that you started with, I've done some great work already that I'm super encouraged by. So basically, I talked to Mr. Welty and Mr. Zellinger about talking to you guys about the stuff that I've seen, mostly my past 10 years here in Wake County, and just trying to give you guys a perspective from a person, a lawyer that speaks to clients that are directly impacted by our current local criminal justice system here in Raleigh every day. I had some problem, kind of properly communicating to people like where the real flaws lie in this, because when I talk to my clients, they don't necessarily recognize it for being flaws in the system. They see it as this is just the way it is. I don't have the rights that are supposed to be accorded to me by the Constitution. I know I have the right to say no to a stop, but once an officer stops me and talks to me, I'm done. And I just, you can take me from here and do whatever you need to do to make the situation either lessen upon myself or make the situation resolve itself as quickly as possible. I have a hard time even having things pop to mind where one of my clients asserts their rights when they could have or should have, as opposed to just willingly conceding or consenting to a search that very well was an improper search to begin with, but once they give consent, I'm left with representing them. So I just tried to come up with some like global ideas, and I think you guys have already probably discussed these a little bit already, but I think the major intersection and major impact, and I guess if you wanted me to put everything in a huge nutshell, for reasons I think that are desperately treating some parts of our community as simple as just over policing. I live on Rock Quarry, on the intersection of Rock Quarry Road right here downtown. I used to live on the west end of Hargett Street. So my house is not separated more than 2 miles. But the amount of police officers that I would regularly see at my house on West Hargett Street and then my house closer to Rock Quarry Road is night and day. And I'm coming at it from a perspective of, you know, I'm a lawyer, my wife is a lawyer, we drive a minivan. We are not typically the people that are going to be suspected of being impacted by just a general stop. But people that live in that community and get pulled over for things that are innocuous, like expired registration or a speeding ticket or passing a stop sign, when my clients in that position get pulled over, the typical way that it goes is just being searched, when I don't think typically that everybody would be searched in that situation. Had one of my junior attorneys step up last week and say, had a client that had no record whatsoever, driving with an expired registration. Officer pulls her over, comes to her, and like I said, typically police officers know, they've run the license plate, know kind of what the person's situation is, knew that she had nothing on her, but still asked to search the car. And that is not something that I see being applied equally across all people that get pulled over for those kind of situations. This situation went even further than that, where this officer ended up searching her trunk and finding a diet pill, which fen-phen, which classifies as a controlled substance. And she caught a felony charge for that, or excuse me, she caught a misdemeanor charge for that, but had no prior interaction with the criminal justice system whatsoever. Looking at the stop, they had no reason to extend the stop in that way. It is something where she just consented to and agreed to it because she felt like she was in a position where she had been pulled over by this officer. The best way for me to extricate myself from this situation is to comply fully. And it put her in a position where she's now getting appointed. She has this impact by having a blemish on her record until it gets expunged. I think she actually had to make a bond and bond out. This money is non-refundable, and if she had spent any more time in jail, how that could have further impacted her career, her life, her family's life. And I saw some stuff about community policing, and I've been a part of the Raleigh Police Department's Citizens Police Board. I've gone through that training twice. And we always have a big push for community policing, and I've seen a lot of your slides talk about it as well. I would want to know what actually that looks like, because I've always heard it talked about, well, we're going to get to know the community, we're going to be there, we're going to be out there. And I think you guys touch on it some with, well, we need to have officers stay in the community, actually live there, actually interact with people on a day-to-day basis as actual citizens, and not an officer sitting in a parked car where we always know that officers are going to be there, and more as a neighbor. I think there's always a broad umbrella put on community policing, but every time I try to picture it, and what I've seen on movies where an officer is walking the beat and knows, hey, Miss Smith lives over there, Miss Johnson lives over there, these are people I want to talk to. I don't know how much I've ever seen that actually put into action besides we're going to try the community police. Trying to build those inroads and trying to get to know people better, and also police having more awareness of how they are perceived and what people in the community feel when they're actually pulled over. It's something that, you know, I think my clients have to deal with all the time. And it's hard to kind of put that into words about the situation you may be placed in when you've done absolutely nothing wrong whatsoever. And I think one thing that I mentioned to Mr. Welty, Mrs. Ellinger, I would love to see, I know Raleigh has is supposed to have a mandate where police officers give people, they have a full written consent to perform a search without any kind of probable cause. I would love that to be instituted, period. For a person to be able to take a step back, not knowing the law, not being a police officer, not being a lawyer, and saying, I do not have to do this. These are my constitutional rights. I do not have to consent to a search. If the police officer has probable cause for another reason, that's a whole other topic. But these kind of consent searches or these weird searches where an officer just always has the smell of marijuana in his nose and that opens him up to a further search is a real problem. Because we see that constantly where an officer builds their PC based on the smell of marijuana. No marijuana is ever found, no marijuana is in a car, but maybe a gun is found. And then all the pretext about the marijuana that is never really litigated. We're just trying to help the client deal with the firearm charge or whatever charge came from that stop based upon odor of marijuana that we can never prove at this point, besides our officer getting up there and saying he smelled marijuana. So hopefully that was useful in some way. I wanted to keep within my time limit as well. I appreciate the work you guys are doing, and if I could answer anything more specifically or try to give you my client's perspectives in like more exact situations, I'm more than happy to do so.
Thank you, sir. Thank you both. I would like to just start off the conversations and then I'm going to step back, but I do have a question for Mr. Thomas and then one for Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Thomas, has it been your experience that a lot of these stops are born out of regulatory stops, and have you given any consideration that they may be a function of financial disparities that the initial stop takes place, and whether or not law enforcement officers are overly focusing on those, and whether or not there's some work to be done? I know we're going to be doing some work about traffic stops, and some other groups are too as well. And then the question for Mr. Kennedy to consider, or just ask you to kind of explain to some of our panelists the NIBR's National Incident-Based Reporting, and kind of give them a greater understanding of how that works and how that could improve data reporting. So Mr. Thomas and then Mr. Kennedy.
Yes, sir, absolutely. I think the fear of going to jail is sometimes even surpassed by the fear of having your license revoked again or adding another ticket on. We try to do a good job here at clearing up tickets, but that is just as impactful as any kind of criminal warrant as having a client, especially here in Raleigh, where we don't have great public transit, that still has to go to work, and something spiraling out of control because they know they don't have a license. They may get pulled over for the officer running their tag and recognizing they don't have a license, and then that turning into some kind of felony fleeing to elude or some kind of additional interaction with a police officer that could have been stopped if we did a better job at not having these impact the fines kind of snowball and get to a point where a person just feels like they can't fix this problem. So absolutely, just regulatory issues that, not having your car inspected, having a broken windshield, things like that that are, would love to fix it if they had the money to do so, and then creates a contact with the police that may go the wrong way.
Ms. Kennedy, you're on mute.
Right. Sorry. Thank you. So, the sort of the nitty gritty details of NIBRS, how it works, is sort of the domain of my co-author. But I can say a few things, and these are the obvious things. First of all, it's been voluntary, right? And as Jeff pointed out, North Carolina has now made a commitment to sort of move towards the NIBRS reporting. And I'll say the obvious thing: it's burdensome, right? We're talking about paperwork. We're talking about it costs money to have someone to sort of keep track of this. It takes time for officers to check boxes and fill out, their paperwork on their end. And it takes some resources for someone at that agency to be responsible for compiling that and then sort of pushing it up the channel. What I would say, though, is especially when we're talking about arrests that by their very nature carry felony consequences that disenfranchise people, that effectively disintegrate them from the productive working economy, it's absolutely worth that cost. The other thing I want to highlight, and Jeff sort of alluded to this, agencies who participate in NIBRS aren't engaging in data transparency. I mean, we had to chase after people in Michigan to get them to send us this data in these files, and then we had to work on these files to turn them into some sort of usable form. What we need in this area is not just collecting the data and participating in NIBRS. We need true data transparency. I mean, I know in Chapel Hill, you can go online and they publish statistics about their stops. That's what we need with respect to these drug arrests. You need to be able to go online and say, who's getting arrested for drugs? Not the name of the person, but the race of the people and for how much. And I think, again, I'll go back to the analogy of if you had a sales force, it's just a basic principle of political accountability that I think everyone needs to know. Oh, sorry, I'll get off the soapbox.
No, thank you. I think it's very informative for all of us. And so with that, I'd like to recognize any one of our work group members for any questions that they may have for either one of our well-received guests.
Sheriff Clemens.
Go ahead, Sheriff.
Hey, Mr. Thompson, when I heard you speak and you were talking about your clients that have these traffic stops that lead into other aspects of an arrest, and you were saying that sometimes they were more concerned about fines or the arrest, but my concern is this: that officer is responsible, number one, when they make that stop, what is the scope of the stop? And if you're stopping a person because of an inspection violation, then why would we need to be asking them whether they have drugs, guns, or what have you in their vehicle? In my agency, that is one of the conversations that I have with my officers. I call that stop, if you're stopping the car and it's an inspection violation, inform them that they have that in violation, give them an opportunity to rectify that situation. I don't see where that scope of that particular stop or light being out alludes to suspicion for drugs or anything else. And I understood what you said when you made the comment about officers have the odor of marijuana constantly in their nose. Well, what I say to that is this: let's call out those officers who do those things and these officers that make the bad decisions and the bad deeds in the performance of their duties, rather than to paint every law enforcement officers as what officers do, because that's not what every officer do. But I am concerned about that. That has been a concern of mine over these 41 years that I've served. But I feel as though that it should be litigated in court. If that is not the scope of that particular stop, then our courts need to take place, and we as agency heads need to do a better job of making sure that our folks understand what that valid stop is and what is reasonable. And like I said before, my pet peeve is, why do we ask people about guns and drugs when you stop them for a stop sign violation?
Thank you, Sheriff.
Yeah, thank you, Sheriff. I absolutely agree with the first part there because I think we're on the same page there. The example that I brought up was one of those things where the person stopped for an inspection and then one officer's like, well, you don't mind if I search the rest of your car, do you? And they say, no, go ahead and search. Definitely not meaning to call out every and all officer, but I know you've probably seen it as well. The problem with the court system having to depend on them to fix it is because in that specific situation, say that person got charged with a felony based on odor of marijuana stop. I go to court, maybe that guy's been in custody, he's been in custody 20 days. And because he's where our bond system is now, he still hasn't been able to make bond.
Right.
We go to court, I go and talk to the DA and say, hey, this stop don't look right. As opposed to getting, as opposed to the court handling it, the DA will more than likely say, well, I'll give him misdemeanor credit for time served. And it stops for the client. The client may not be happy about it, but it's done. He's out of jail. He doesn't have to pay any money. That officer, there's no accountability for that person either. But we can also, the way to continue to fight that is, well, I've got to send it up to Superior Court. This person may sit in Superior Court or wait to go to Superior Court another 6 to 8 months or maybe even a year. I don't know what that Superior Court judge is going to think of that stop. I could be absolutely wrong. So I'm asking them to take a gamble with, their liberty, that felony. So there are just so many, I guess, the easy exits before we get to that point that accountability, there need to be further steps before that, as opposed to letting the court hold officers or people accountable, because most often it's not handled through a trial and it's not handled by a judge, it's handled between negotiations.
If I could,
I think we need to, Mr. Thompson, we need to keep a focus on that. I agree with you, but we still need to make sure and ensure that, when these folks come to court, if we're going to talk about a just justice system, then we all need to be a part of it. Now, as an administrator, I'm not privy to every court case that my deputies have, but I would know that if the DAs and the courts would allude to that and make those decisions, even if it means dismiss that case based upon the mere fact that it did not meet the scope of that stop. That's a start right there. And then with that being dismissed and I get that information, then I can educate, train, discipline, do whatever I need to do to make sure that we're doing the right job. But I don't think it's right for the public to suffer and have to take a plea because they're worried about, well, this could happen or that could happen. I think we put people in place to make those decisions to help the public. And that's why the distrust in our system is the way it is, because they don't get that help when they walk into our courtrooms or when they're out there dealing with law enforcement officers, or vice versa. The officers get that bad name because of what another officer did. So it's a lot of work that we have to do. But if we're going to be serious about reform, if we're going to be serious about justice, then we need to make sure that justice lies where it should lie.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. And we did talk a little bit about traffic stops, and again, for the good of the group, we're going to delve into that a little deeper, a little bit further. But it related to this because the specter or the prospect of pretextual stops and how that leads to drug investigations. But I want to make sure that we stay focused on the drug investigations piece on this part, and so I would like to open it back up to any of our work group members concerning the topic at hand for drug investigations. Any questions you have or comments you have for our speaker, or just some concepts for the group?
It's Kerwin Pittman. I agree wholeheartedly, and I can't wait till we kind of dive into the stops and the arrests and data surrounding the stops and thereof. But we definitely need to be proactive instead of being reactive on that one. When someone enters the court system, that trying to rectify a situation on that end is reactive. So we definitely need database and data tracking, particularly when it comes surrounding excuse me, particularly when it comes surrounding the smell of marijuana. We need some type of system in place to track individuals and data to put down the probable cause if it is marijuana. But I'm gonna shy away from that to stick on topic. So this NIBRS system, to hear what I'm hearing today, it is kind of disheartening to think that we have a system that's operating on this scope with lack of transparency. It is no reason why all law enforcement agencies within the state of North Carolina is not fully disclosing all information and participating in the NIBRS system. Not only that, but collecting the data, including quantities that they are arresting individuals for, and not making this publishable and accessible to the public, in which they owe the explanation to. So that is something we must really look and divulge deeply into, as well as individuals. 40% of individuals, and I know it's probably a little more than that, but 40% of individuals are locked up for 0.25 traceable amount of narcotics is just mind-blowing to me. We definitely need to look at this and make some recommendation to kind of stop this oppression from happening, to be honest, and to be frank with you, and especially surrounding marijuana, to be honest with you. So I look forward to having some concrete conversations. I thank Mr. Kennedy and Mr. Thomas for your excellent presentations, and I definitely will be following up with each one of you to just gain a little more insight for the sake of time, because I got a lot of questions.
Thank you, sir. Task force members, you don't have to wait for me to recognize you. Jump right on in.
Great. This is Angelica, and I just want to echo Kerwin and what you said, and just make the observation, Mr. Kennedy, I wholeheartedly agree with you in terms of the need for transparency. We have had conversations in this workforce and in the larger group of I mean, what's happening, which is how do we build trust in communities as it relates to law enforcement? And, you know, and I feel that transparency is one of the first steps in terms of how do we build trust, right? We have nothing to hide. Here's the data. This is what we're seeing. And the reality is you don't know what you don't know, right? If you're not keeping track of it. And so I think that that's key. You can't address an issue if you don't know what you don't know. And, you know, and I think that, yes, it can be cumbersome, but the value out of that information is key to be able to address the issues that are at hand.
Secretary Hooks, I wonder if I could jump in with a question, in part because this flows from what another work group is considering, but I want to ask Professor Kennedy. You said that the source of the disparities, the racial disparities, is driven by the type of drug that people are being arrested for. And I apologize that I haven't read your article yet, but I wonder if you could expand on that and help us a little bit, because if I caught your numbers right, another work group is looking at legalizing simple possession of marijuana. And if 75% of whites are arrested for marijuana possession and only 65% of African Americans, that step, it seems to me, is actually going to exacerbate the racial disparities. And so from the lens of how do we address these issues, and particularly the racial disparities, can you say more about how the type of drug is driving the disparities?
Sure. Yeah. And so first, I did say partially driven, because obviously there's layers to this, right? For example, if you're over policing certain neighborhoods and under policing other neighborhoods, for example, you're not really policing UNC campus. Or if you want to talk about high crime areas in terms of drug crime, probably any college campus would qualify as a high crime area, right? But if you're heavily policing minority neighborhoods, that's going to put in already a disparity that my research can't touch, right? Because my research just comes after people get arrested. So what I can say based on after people get arrested is you can see whites get arrested more for certain types of drugs, right? Even trace amounts. But what we see is we arrest less often for those let's call them quote unquote white drugs, right? And it's especially interesting when you think, obviously, so those sort of quote white drugs might be methamphetamine and opioids. It's sort of particularly interesting now, and we all realize, people are dying from opioid abuse every day. Really, really very few people actually die from taking cocaine in either crack or powder form, but we haven't been historically arresting that much for opioids, that much for meth. Proportionally, we're arresting a ton for crack, which is, from a health perspective, the least dangerous drug of those three. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Also, just Jeff Welty has also done some research about NIBRS compliant. Maybe he has a little bit of a nugget of information he can provide to us concerning NIBRS compliant data.
Sure, happy to do that. And I know this relates to Professor Kennedy's idea of data collection and transparency. The easiest way to understand what data historically has been, the FBI runs some national data collection efforts, and what historically was the main effort was something that people call the UCR, the Uniform Crime Reports. And that was basically agencies just submitted a simple monthly tally of how many of certain violent crimes had been committed in their jurisdiction. So, the Cary Police Department would report through the SBI to the FBI. We had 2 murders, 6 robberies, and 3 rapes last month. So 10 crimes, just incidents, no detail. And that was helpful for measuring time, trends over time in crime commission, but it really didn't allow anything like the level of granularity or detail that Professor Kennedy's work involved, and it didn't collect any data about drug crimes at all. So it just wasn't a very good system. I think Professor Kennedy kind of adverted to the fact that his paper was based on this national NIBRS data, and it didn't include North Carolina data because North Carolina didn't participate in NIBRS as an overall rule. The FBI is essentially phasing out that UCR older style of data collection and moving towards the national incident-based reporting system, the NIBRS system. And that collects information on a way bigger number of crimes, like 52 different crimes instead of 10. And it collects a lot more contextual detail about each crime, not just the fact that it was committed, but demographics about who committed it, details for drug cases about drug quantity, involvement of a weapon. There's like 47 different fields that are collected for each incident. And so the FBI is phasing out the old system, phasing in NIBRS essentially nationwide. And the SBI here in North Carolina is helping agencies kind of get up to speed and participating in NIBRS. And I think it's something like 94% of the population of the state is now covered by agencies that either are already participating or are sort of on the track to participate in NIBRS. So the data collection is going way up in North Carolina because of this shift to NIBRS. But the point that Professor Kennedy just made about transparency, I think is still right, because that NIBRS data is not in a format or designed to be readily accessible to the general public. So researchers can get their hands on it, and the SBI and FBI can crunch those numbers in various ways and generate various reports, but it's not a sort of public repository of information. So if that's what's desired, the shift to NIBRS won't accomplish that. But I did want everybody to know that we have moved from this old, very rudimentary data collection system, and we're almost complete to a shift to collecting much, much, much more robust data, just still with some questions perhaps about access.
Thank you, Jeff. And just to add a little bit further context, that push has been going for over a decade, where the SBI has been pushing to get that data in departments to report data in that manner. But again, NIBRS data is not a panacea of transparency by any means. I do a quick question for Mr. Thomas, and then I did see Tally had his hand up. When we talk about data transparency, and I'll just throw a scenario out there just to think through. If an officer makes a drug arrest, and in order to get to that immediate upload of information, and they say that 6 grams of whatever was reported. Then, however, that drug is sent to the lab and it comes back as 8 grams or 5 grams. You being, an officer of the court and in the adversarial system, how much of a difference is that? Neither one of those are trafficking amounts generally, but how much is the difference is that going to make in a adversarial system for that officer? Because we want to do things to encourage officers to be transparent, but recognizing on the side of the road with an initial report, they may not have the exact weight and measure that would come through after the lab does a result.
I don't think that's something I would be able to, with a straight face up and down in front of a jury about and saying he said 06 and it's actually 8 and things. That kind of negligible difference wouldn't make a difference to me, and I don't think it will make much of a difference to a district attorney or how I would end up attacking that case. A lot of times, their drugs are usually packaged in a way that the officer, I think it's probably more likely that he weighs it at his higher than it goes to lab and it goes down a little bit once they take it out of the packaging and weigh the actual controlled substance as opposed to everything that is wrapped up in. So I don't believe that there would be any harm at giving that full information or that full weight at the earliest possible stage.
Thank you, sir. And Mr. Wells, we've lost you. Okay, Mr. Wells, I saw you.
Yeah. Thank you, Secretary Hooks, and thank you to each of you. One of the things I'm really interested from any speakers, but particularly on this topic, is just some concrete proposals of sort of what you think makes sense to take on these issues. Professor Kennedy, I had family walk in for a minute while you were speaking, so if I missed any specific, I apologize. But so that's one question. And then you've also both used the term over-policing. And, I'm sort of interested in the committee's thoughts about that later on. But I guess I'll just say that, a number of us participated or listened in to the public comment on Friday, and there was definitely a lot of public comment about our particular working group. And I think some frustration with our working group that was not always completely spelled out, but I think some of that has to do with police and schools, and that's not y'all's topic, but you did mention sort of over policing, and I just wanted to see if y'all had any sort of, since you're here, any reactions to sort of, or thoughts about, or recommendations with respect to just law enforcement in the education setting. Thanks.
Yeah, so I guess, sorry, Deontay, you want to go first?
You will
I think he wants you to go first.
Okay, so I guess with respect to over policing, I'd say the reality is some places are both over policed and under policed at the same time, right? And again, I don't want to paint with a really broad brush. There's a lot of variety in different places, but and I'll be focusing again on the topic for the day, drug investigations. A number of people have made the criticism that one of the most pernicious effects of creating felony liability for any amount of these hard drugs is it's like got this gravitational force in terms of law enforcement resources, right? Every single arrest for any amount of crack cocaine becomes a felony arrest, right? And so, you can spend 3 weeks trying to catch a residential burglar, or you could make a felony drug arrest every single day by hanging out around open air drug markets, right? Who do you think is going to get promoted? Now, the guy who spends 3 weeks catching the residential burglar has arguably done a lot more to make their community feel sort of safe, but that's one arrest in 3 weeks or maybe a month, right? Versus another officer is making an arrest every day. Look, there's blame here to go around, right? The legislature is the ones that makes each of these offenses a felony. And so you're asking me about bottom lines. I'll add a few more takeaways. I didn't want to get out of my lane, with that presentation, but if you're inviting me to, I will. I don't think these small quantity arrests should be felonies, period. I mean, I need to, we've gotten so used to it because that's the way it's always been. We don't question it, but maybe there's a moment now for us to challenge the way it's always been. I mean, if you're not engaging in violent or disruptive behavior and you're selling a small amount of, a harmful substance, why should you get a felony? Whereas if right now you punch me in the face, that's going to be a misdemeanor. If you steal something from me, that's going to be a misdemeanor. But if you sell me something that I voluntarily want to buy and you're not causing any other trouble and you're not hassling anybody walking by, you're going to get a felony for that. And I think we need that. We need to change that, because that drives the incentive structures that a lot of these officers are responding to. This is a felony. I did the search. I found this in the trunk. It's a felony. I need to make this arrest. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Kennedy. And everything, I agree with everything Professor Kennedy just said, and kind of touch on the question that you asked Mr. Wells. I don't see the I guess societal benefit to having continued police involvement in public schools. And I don't want to get ridiculously sidetracked on something I wasn't brought here to talk about. But I think the studies have shown that once you have those kind of contacts, especially if they're starting at school, you don't finish school, that is typically a person who's going to end up with me in the criminal justice system eventually. So we should be trying to find ways to avoid that if at all possible, especially if police in schools is kind of getting away from what they initially started as and envisioned as, which was prevent school shootings, now being used to conduct disciplinary action that leads to criminal records, or having drugs in school that then leads to criminal records. Everyone's well aware of the school to prison pipeline, but it's a very real thing. And then just the continual societal impact is them ending up with in the adult criminal justice system eventually.
And do you have any specific recommendations just on to follow up with Professor Kennedy, Mr. Thomas, just on the drug investigations, anything specific we should be thinking about?
What was that for, or to follow up with?
Yeah, that was for you, Mr. Thomas.
No, besides the fact that for personal use, amount of drugs shouldn't be a felony. I think the perception is there is no such thing that a person that uses cocaine cannot be functional, but there are plenty of people that are regular cocaine users that are just as functional as we know functional alcoholics that come to work, do a good job every day, and they go home and that's what they do. The impact that felony has, especially until our bond situation is looked at appropriately, is that we're more likely to have people in jail pending prison for that charge. And the way the law is set up now, where this person with a personal use amount of drugs, if their record is bad enough, if they've had 3 prior felonies, can then be threatened as an habitual felon based on a personal, that 0.25 grams of cocaine. Luckily, it doesn't happen too much here in Wake County, but there are counties around the state that if you're a habitual felon, you will be indicted as an habitual felon. And that's what you will be either fighting at your trial for or what you will be pleading to. And when that status gets kicked up, a person could be doing 5, 6, 7 years for 0.25 grams of controlled substance.
So just to make sure I understood your last point, or part of your last point about the bail. So part of what you're saying, and I assume there's a race and socioeconomic equity issue. If you can't bond out, then a lot of folks who have these smaller substance offenses before they actually have trial are just going to be in jail for a long time.
Correct.
Okay. I just want to make sure I understand.
Yeah, no problem. Especially before the pandemic, everything is different now, but it was nothing for that person that I just spoke of to possibly sit in jail 8 months to a year or longer even on the exact same scenario that I'm talking about with a small amount of a controlled substance. And this person may be sitting in jail for months on a $2,000 bond. They just don't have $200 to bail out with. And then that makes them make decisions whether it's accepting a plea where the case may not be that strong, or everything that you can lose in that period of time. Stability, your disability, any kind of assistance you were receiving, all that goes away, and that person has to restart once we try to reintegrate them back into society whenever that time passes.
Thank you.
Could I just add one thing to what Deontay said? There is really, in my experience, there's like two different systems. There's a system for people who are in custody and a system for people who are out of custody. If you're out of custody, you're going to get like a much different deal than if you're in custody. If you're in custody, they've got you. At some point, you're just going to say yes to time served. Guilty, innocent, it doesn't matter most of the time. If you're out of custody, well, you can fight that case, right? That's the most important determinant of what happens to you in that system. Can you get out of custody?
That's right. I totally agree with that. This is Kerwin Pittman here, and I'd like to add some recommendations for the work group to possibly consider surrounding this particular issue. And for those who know me, I'll be following up with an email because I'm pretty sure I'm going to forget some more recommendations behind this. But one, I would like to see full participation in the NIBRA system, even though the traceable of different data that's put into the system may not be readily available for community members. I still feel it is important for the sake of transparency for all law enforcement agencies to participate in this system, as well as law enforcement agency, each and every one of them, to participate in some searchable form of data collection surrounding their own departments, and for this to be published in a searchable form and readily available for community members. It could lead possibly after the model I think someone said that Chapel Hill is doing, but please be sure to emphasize and include, when it comes to particularly drugs, the quantity in which that they are arresting individuals for. Another recommendation is for policy enforcement upon traceable drugs that is found to not be, and maybe this will be statutory. We can lean towards the legislation for it not to be a felony if we could reduce that. But in the meantime, and in between time, can we get them to kind of de-emphasize the enforcement of arrest for traceable amounts of narcotics found? Another thing we should look into is the legalization of marijuana, into what quantity and which we might need to look into to push for statutory, as well as the emphasis and the de-emphasis on arrest on a particular amount of marijuana. Another recommendation we could look into is alternates outside of arresting individuals for particularly these things to be promoted within law enforcement systems and for them to promote as well. Hold on. I wrote a couple of them down. As well as, so I would like to take a look at as well as what the injustices against the war on drugs that has been done in the past. So we can't forget that what happened in the past and the victims of collateral damage of the war on drugs. So we might need to go back and make a recommendation to revisit these individuals getting these type of traceable amounts expunged from their records. They shouldn't be stifled for something that is so minute, and in the past the system kind of punished them for. So we're going to make a total of the whole system, then I think we might need to focus and look on that as well. And I know some of these things will take legislative push, but if we can implement these as well as policy push for law enforcement agencies right now, I think that would be great. And as of right now, I'll send an email out for the sake of time, like I said, later with additional recommendations and my thoughts.
Thank you, Mr. Pittman. I'd also want to draw the work group's attention to the chat box. Ellen Spoler has provided some information, and Professor Kennedy has also provided a link for our education and expansion of our thought process as well.
Mr. Secretary.
Yes, sir.
I'll jump in on my 2 cents here. I know Mr. Wells asked if there was something that, or some recommendations that we thought that we should put forth to kind of start talking about. And when I hear what we're talking about, the first thing comes to my mind is the amount of time it's going to take to get results from some of the things that we're talking about. But I think Mr. Thomas mentioned something that we've skipped over that can really be implemented with just a stroke of a pen from an agency head and really have an impact on this investigation piece that we're talking about. And what I'm referring to is the written consent form. The Raleigh Police Department requires that our officers now have a written consent form. It's not good enough for you to say, I got consent because they gave it to me. And now there's a form. And what that form does, it educates the person signing that form that they in fact have the right to refuse this search, and they have the right to stop this search at any moment. And they also have the right to limit the scope of this search. So you can search the right side of this car, but you can't search the left side, or you can't go into the glove box or the center console. And a lot of people don't have that knowledge. And as a police officer myself, I've been stopped in my personal vehicle, and I've been asked, can I search your vehicle? My response is no. And I can tell you as a police officer, out of uniform, as a black man in a vehicle, to tell a police officer, no, you can't search my car. It can be a difficult task for someone who doesn't know and understand the rights that they have. But that form gives you a minute to stop. It slows that search down. It gives you the opportunity to look. And maybe I don't say no. Maybe I just don't sign that form. And no signature means no. And that has a direct impact immediately on this investigation piece. So if I were going to say we were going to do anything right off the bat, I say we start to talk about that and maybe put up a recommendation for a requirement for more agencies to take place in the written consent form, because it's simple. It doesn't cost them anything. All they do is create the form.
Can I just add something to that? Because Asheville also implemented a written consent form as well. But it's my understanding is that, yes, you can refuse. You can say, I do not give you consent to search my car, but it doesn't change the fact that if sometime one or another if a police officer has probable cause, that whether you consent or not, if there is probable cause, it doesn't stop it. And so I would just say that if that was the case, how do we track that of the people who did not give consent? How many actually rose to the subsequent probable cause piece of it, if that makes any sense? But I think it's a great idea. I think it's a brilliant idea.
I think it does. As a police officer, if I have probable cause, I'm not going to cloud that up with asking for your consent, because then I've got to work around you telling me no. If I've got the PC to do the search, I'm going to just go ahead and do it.
Yeah, but there's nothing to say that if I said I don't give you consent to search my car, that subsequently something else couldn't be used as, well, you didn't consent, but guess what? I smell marijuana. I'm going to search your car. And so for me I think that one of the pieces of using the written consent form is, if you are going to do that, can you track not only how many people give consent and how many don't, and of the instances where consent isn't given, was there a subsequent search due to probable cause?
Right. And that's something that gets tracked in the other portion of the reporting for the stop. As the consent form goes, and there are some officers who operate with the fact that they just ask everybody for consent. And there are ways to construct your conversation that sometimes that people don't even realize that they've given you the consent. And what I'm saying is that consent form slows it down. Real quick, and I won't take up too much time. If I ask you, do you have anything in this car that's going to hurt me? And your answer to that response obviously is going to be, no, I don't have anything in this car that's going to hurt you. Or if I say, hey, would you ever hurt me? And you go, I would never hurt you. Well, do you have anything in this car that's going to hurt me? And do you mind if I look? And I've asked you 3 separate questions, right? You're going to answer one of them, and the answer is going to be no, because I don't have anything in the car that's going to hurt you most of the time. But then I've also said, did you mind if I look? So guess what I just got? Consent, and you had no clue. But if I have a consent form that I've got to fill out, that slows that stop down. It also gives you the time as the person being stopped to think, okay, if I read this, and if you can't read, then the officer's going to read it to you. And then you're going to have that opportunity to go, nah, I'm good. I'm not going to allow you to do that. And that's kind of why I think the form is important.
I would agree with you. My observation is more on tracking. That's all. But yeah.
If I could jump in with just 2 small points in this area. One, there was actually a judge in New York who finally said, I'm done with smelling marijuana. From now on, you don't get to search based on you smell marijuana. It's what you guys always say. And she said, no more. Now, that story was notable because it was exceptional. Judges just sort of accept it, right? So the officer knows it's an easy automatic yes, if they claim they smell marijuana. The other point is officers under Fourth Amendment case law don't have to tell you when you're free to go. If you really want to sort of fully empower people, they should have that obligation. You shouldn't have to guess when the stop is over or whether a stop has taken place at all.
All right. Thank you. Would anybody else like to weigh in? One of the other things I would like to just add that, and we have tried to push this from my many years over at the SBI for people to become engaged in NIBRS compliant reporting. It's a great benefit to the law enforcement agencies, because if you have a series of rapes, perhaps, and it gives you that opportunity to put that there was a red truck associated with it. Well, there may be something in other communities out there, and that gives some leads toward benefiting agencies across North Carolina. So they should not look at it as just something that adds to the workload. It has great value to the law enforcement agencies if they use the information that can be of value to them and be of value to the larger public. And that is where I see the win for all communities involved.
I think we should add emphasis on probable cause searches surrounding smelling odor of drugs for data collection, as Ms. Wynn was saying. I think that's just what she was saying, Mr. Gardner, just pretty much just having some type of transparency as far as data collection surrounding I smell marijuana, so we can particularly track those bad apples who are just utilizing that the PC to get a search done and try to get a hit.
Does anyone else have any questions or thoughts for our guest here today? We're at 3:03, and we probably have about 10 more minutes to address during this time frame for drug investigation. So whether it's a question for our guests or any additional insights that you may have for the benefit of the work group as we continue to learn and work through this process.
Secretary Hooks, this is Jasmine, if I may.
Yes, ma'am.
Just wanted to give the working group the information that Working Group 3 does have a meeting scheduled on marijuana related to sort of its place in our statutes. I think, issues related to policing practices and enforcement practices are obviously within the purview of this group, but I wanted the group to know in terms of the sort of whether it is criminalized and how there is a plan to address that within the task force.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate that. And I see that provides another opportunity for synergy to be built between the task forces and the connections that we have between the group with our substantive leads. Let me just throw this out there for a thought, not for necessarily controversy, because I do support the efforts to abate opioid substance abuse disorders and all of that. But do we have any additional perspectives? Because there seems to be quite a bit of energy over the last couple of years concerning, opioid abuse and allowing folks to come in and turn in their opioid drugs or in those things that have hit what some people say middle America. Let's be frank, it's been white America, that have not been afforded to African Americans and other minorities. And it's certainly not any offering by me, but we have not seen that type of energy in minority communities. And I would just like to see if anyone has any perspectives about whether or not there have been lessons learned that we have made positive progress in opioids, and why couldn't we do the same with some of the drugs that have traditionally hit Black communities. I don't particularly favor the legalization of drugs. However, if there's a move afoot to really get at substance use disorders, then why isn't that the pathway? And can I offer that as as opposed to the idea that drugs should be legalized or what have you? And I'm not speaking about all gamut of drugs, but some of those serious drugs and opioids and cocaine and all of those are other type drugs that I'm referring to.
I definitely agree. It should be some recommendation. And well said, Hooks. It definitely should be some recommendation surrounding drugs that are more used by those who are in the marginalized communities versus the opioid crisis. So if we're going to treat the opioid epidemic like an epidemic, let's treat the crack epidemic like a same type of crisis we're treating a substance abuse crisis, or cocaine substance abuse crisis like we're treating these other ones that particularly the white communities utilize. I think everything that's afforded to the opioid crisis should be afforded to particularly the crack epidemic, individuals suffering from the using of crack and the addiction to crack. We should afford them the same opportunities that we're affording everybody else.
Professor, you're on mute.
Sorry, if I could just say one thing. I mean, I think it's important that some of these resources not be funneled through the criminal justice system. I mean, there have been like proposals in various places. Oh, you can go to the police station and turn this in, and then you can get referrals. It's like, no, you shouldn't have to identify yourself to law enforcement as someone who uses illegal drugs in order to get help. The only reason, when you think about it, why would you go to the police station? Well, because the police station is the only place in a lot of communities that's open 24 hours, that take you on a walk-in basis, right? And you don't need an appointment. Right? Well, why aren't there sort of health facilities in these communities that will sort of operate on the same basis? I mean, it's an obvious point, but the larger point is, if you only have hammers, you're going to look at everything as a nail. If there are public health resources in these communities, everything doesn't have to you don't have to go to the court system to get referred to substance abuse counseling.
Thank you, sir. Would anyone else like to weigh in concerning either this or something else concerning drug investigations over the next 5 minutes? All right, I don't see anyone volunteering right now. If something comes to mind, please feel free to share it with the working groups as you already have. And so now I'm going to move to agenda item number 4 and have Jeff and staff outline plans for upcoming meetings. And Jasmine and Ellen and Greg, if you have insight about other work group meetings that we certainly should take particular note of, feel free to let us know that too as well. Jeff?
Okay, thank you, Secretary Hooks. We have 2 more meetings on the schedule at this point, at least prior to the next set of recommendations being due to the full task force. And as I mentioned at the outset, one of those meetings is going to be November 5th. That's the second meeting on the topic of investigations. And we're planning for that one to focus in on traffic enforcement and traffic investigations. Right now, I think it will at least have 2 speakers, perhaps 3, but Frank Baumgartner, who many of you know from UNC and who's written quite a bit about traffic stops, is planning to join us. Harold Medlock, who is the former police chief in Fayetteville, North Carolina, who did some interesting reprioritization of traffic enforcement in his city, and who sat on President Obama's task force on 21st century policing, is planning to join us. We may have another guest as well, but we'll look forward to that. And then the last currently scheduled meeting is November 9th. And at that meeting, we've got probably a number of items that we'll need to address. One that the group has been kind of had a renewed interest in, it seems like, is going back to the school resource officer question in some way. And the one thing that would be helpful for us as staff in trying to tee that meeting up is for folks who want to get back at that question, what information can we help to provide, and what exactly are folks wanting to discuss? Is it just the sort of fundamental question of should SROs be in schools at all, or are there other issues related to SROs that folks are interested in? So that's kind of the plan for those next 2 meetings, and a couple of things that would help us as staff.
And I encourage you all to email directly to Jeff and his crew your thoughts concerning that so that they can get it teed up for us. Jasmine, do you have any additional?
I just wanted to remind the working group that working group 3 is having a special meeting this afternoon if you're not zoomed out, but you could watch it later at 4:15 on reimagining justice system responses and focusing on victims of color, trauma, and restorative justice. And it also touches on issues that you all have been discussing related to reimagining public safety. So we wanted to encourage you to participate if you're able.
Thank you, ma'am. Does anyone else have anything that they'd like to offer? Mr. Wells.
Yeah, I just want to follow up a little on what I had said earlier. First of all, I just want to say thank you to our guests. Y'all were great, and just really appreciate you giving us this time and the work that you do. And I'm also very grateful that you're going to go back and write up some recommendations and send it to Jeff. So that will be wonderful. If any sort of suggestions you have, I think it would be really great to have. I did want to just say a little bit more. I think a number of us were on the public comment on Friday, and I think there is feelings within at least some parts of the community that it is important to look at the school resource officer issue again. I've been doing a lot of talking with community members just about the issue, and I guess my sort of question is a few. I mean, one, I would really like, both those on this committee, but also, whatever's come through the public comment and anything that we've received that has recommendations, but also data. I mean, I feel like this is a critical issue. There were certain reasons why law enforcement grew in our schools, and some of that was thought out, some of it wasn't thought out. Regardless, it is definitely a part of the system right now. And I feel like it's just a really important topic. And one of the things I've been thinking about is schools are schools. And, one of the things that I think this is an important learning issue. And, it may be that we're also thinking about just how the education system talks to children and youth about law enforcement and the role of law enforcement and getting their feedback and their thoughts. Because one of the things I'm really interested in is if there's anything out there, particularly from children and youth who are children of color, what their own opinions are. And I know Billy Lassiter gave us a lot of interesting information. We got sort of contradicting information from the UNC professor. But just the more information I can gather, because I just personally feel like I need more to really make an educated decision. But I also think that this group is extraordinary. There's, I heard the criticism working group too, but I want to say that I have been so impressed with every person on this working group and how deeply they think about these issues, and what an opportunity we have to have, particularly law enforcement, that are really forward thinking, as this came out in this discussion around drug investigations today, and that there may be some outside of the box things that we want to suggest and recommend around police and schools and elementary children, and around sort of why do we have them? What is the good parts of that? Because I think that there's, what I keep hearing from everyone I talk to is very different opinions. And some of it is just based on the relationship they have with their particular school resource officers. But I want to go back to why they're in the schools, how it benefits and harms law enforcement, how it benefits and harms children, how it benefits and harms the sort of education and school system, so that we can really just look at the whole reasoning behind it. So I apologize for talking so long, but I think that I took seriously the public comment. And I think this is an extraordinary group, and it's an opportunity. And I also wonder, since this task force is going to continue for a couple more years on the implementation stage, if there isn't something sort of longer term that we can be doing to really be part of this conversation within North Carolina around the role of law enforcement in schools and the racial equity issues that come up with that, so that it's not just us quickly making a decision in one or two more meetings, but we're really sort of thinking about something that can really have an impact. So thank you.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate you saying that. I echo your sentiment. We have an outstanding group of individuals, and as we came together from meeting one, the idea was that we may not all agree on every part, but there is much more that unites us to help drive us forward than ever separates us, and that no one of us would ever come away fully believing that we got everything that we desired out of this. If we come in with the mindset that I'm going to enter, get my point in, and walk away just the same. And that's whether you're in government service or not in government service. And so I want to echo that thought process, and because I know the time and attention that you all have given, and I'm also recognizing that that we're not immune to any public criticism. That's what our democracy's about, and we're high in the debate season, and so it's not unexpected. And it just, for me, it adds to the discourse. It adds for us that want to be open-minded so that we can collaborate with each other to move forward smartly. I know that there may have been criticisms about what we have considered, what we haven't considered, but I think you bring up a very valuable point, is that one, we do need to be informed by the data, and we would be remiss if we just walked in with our own various backgrounds and opinion, held a vote on something up or down, and then walked away from it without getting the data. And some of that's going to take time. And so I had, after hearing some of the information that was out there, because on that day I had to chair the State Emergency Response Commission, and so I did not hear the public comment, but I kind of was looped in a little bit later concerning that. I did ask our substantive staff leads to look for additional data, scholarly articles, information that we could bring to the table, because there are diverse opinions about law enforcement in schools, school resource officers, and I think we would be remiss to give a 100% endorsement or 100% they should not be in there without having the information more readily available. And I know that there are entities out there that have done more work on this and traffic stop data that go beyond the time frame by which we've come together. And so I support that. And Mr. Kennedy, Professor Kennedy, if you've got some insight or some colleagues over there that have done some research in that, we welcome that brought to our table.
Yeah, actually, Barbara Fetters on our faculty has done a lot of work in that area. So I'd really recommend you to sort of reach out to her. And she's not only done research and publications, but she's also been practicing, through our clinic. She's been supervising students, handling juvenile delinquency cases and school suspension hearings. So she'd be the prime resource we have to offer.
Thank you. Sheriff, I see you're unmuted. Do you have something for us, sir?
No, sorry, this phone unmutes itself, so it wants me to say something, but I don't have anything to add, Mr. Secretary.
All right. Madam Justice?
Yes, I did unmute to talk. Just to add a resource, I thought, Callie, what you said about hearing from young people, there is a group of students, they're high school students, but students connected with the Youth Justice Project at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. And so they would be one possible resource to, because they have been working on school to prison pipeline issues. And I think that they could address from a student's point of view, what the SROs in the schools mean to them. So that's just one possible resource.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. All right. Does anyone have any pressing? I heard somebody.
That's me, Kerwin. Yeah, and I have a ton of data that was sent to me in different articles that I have been looking through, that I will send them email to Jeff and Greg as well, that I think will be very useful to this conversation.
All right. Thank you, sir. I do believe that information is power for us all. Does anybody have any pressing business, or Greg, Jeff, anyone? Jasmine, have we missed anything?
I have a procedural question for you, Secretary Hooks, or perhaps for the group. There have been a few potential recommendations that have been mentioned today in connection with the investigations topic. And I'm wondering what, our recent process has been to cast a wide net for recommendations, send them out for kind of early opinions and comments, and then bring ones that are popular back for further discussion and a final vote. We can certainly do that process again with these recommendations. We also could wait until we have the second investigations meeting, because the topics of drug investigations and traffic stops obviously align in certain ways. So I just would like some guidance on whether to try to develop recommendations out of this meeting, or whether to wait until we have the second investigations meeting and try to develop recommendations out of the two meeting sequence.
Well, I don't want to presume to speak for the entire group, but I do know that there's some interest, and individuals have talked about getting you information that relate to some of the topics and revisiting SROs. I know that because we don't have a number of our, at least a couple of our members, I don't think we have here today, that maybe with the connection with traffic stops and all of that maybe we can tie it all in together. But because I'm looking at my screen, or chime in, do you have a show of hands? Are you okay with getting the second phase of this at our next meeting before trying to push out some recommendations? And it still doesn't cut you off from interacting with Jeff and them, or do you think you need something now to push forward? So I'm gonna take your silence, and I may have awkwardly asked the question about that. I think that we perhaps go forward with the next meeting, and then that gives you all some time to kind of work on the wording, because as we have learned, words do matter, and we want to make sure we get it right. Does anybody else have anything else before I close it out?
Just thank you.
All right. Thank you all. You're a tremendous group. It's an honor to serve on this work group with you all. Thank you.